I want to get ready to have our next guest come up here. We have a local expert, Alli Quinlan. And I've heard her speak before. She's very dynamic, and she's kind of a neighbor of mine. But she's here to talk about us specifically because she's here. We're talking about things on a macro level with Bruce and Dan, but we're also going to get on the micro level right here in Northwest Arkansas. And I think we're going to talk about the future of living in Northwest Arkansas. Alli is an architect, a landscape architect, and if that's not enough, an infill development advocate. Let that sink in. Architect, landscape architect, and an infill development advocate. She founded and runs the Flintlock Limited Company, a multidisciplinary design practice, Flintlock Development, an urban infill real estate development company, and Valkyrie, I love that name, Design Cooperative, a shared services co-op that supports and promotes women in the design profession in Fayetteville. Can I get an amen on that? All right. She also served on the Fayetteville Planning Commission and Construction Board of Appeals and serves as a senior faculty member and board member for the Incremental Development Alliance. Let's give a warm welcome to Alli.
You the sticker? Okay.
Got it. Thank you. Hi, guys. All right. Who was at the Northwest Arkansas Council meeting a few weeks ago? Okay, so this will be familiar for you, for those faces. We did add a little bit more. They let me policy wonk out a little bit more for this one. So hopefully there'll be at least a little new information for you guys. So I run a range of groups, and we have this company ethos, just generally among them all, that we build lovable, sustainable, and generally walkable, dense places so that we can save our productive and sensitive ecosystems from sprawl. I grew up in a rural area and feel really strongly about making lovable cities. As a longtime faculty member and recently appointed acting director for the national nonprofit Incremental Development Alliance, I also subscribe heavily to the ethos that you have to work deeply in a place for decades. And for me, that is Northwest Arkansas. My office made me this graphic last year as we tried to better explain the many facets of housing development that we specialize in. And I hope that the complexity of the ways that I work in housing is illustrative to you mostly of how challenging it is to get housing built these days. And so what does that mean on a day-to-day basis? My team and I are actively involved in virtually every level of housing and development, from construction site walks, to banker's office meetings, to city meetings, fighting about permits. We have several people here who have to fight with me about permits all the time, so we love you guys and appreciate your patience. We paint crosswalks. At least once, I tiled a bathroom 7 months pregnant because we had tenants moving into a building the next day. And so we really talk about kind of this farm at IncDev, that you work in a place long-term, and it's the aggregation of lots of small projects that makes a change. It's not big ribbon-cutting projects. So this is what my farm looks like. And we suggest that the best way to get things done is to make good trouble in your town by working there long enough for your politicians and planners to come to recognize that while you may be a pain in the ass, you are their pain in the ass. So here's the projects that we've undertaken in downtown Fayetteville since I first launched my practice in 2015. And in the single-minded pursuit of making the city more walkable, lovable, and livable, I take on projects ranging from adaptive reuse of vacant buildings for restaurants, a locally owned food co-op, to new construction infill housing in unusual formats, to stream restoration and low-impact development streetscapes, to historic preservation. I wrote and passed with a couple people here the first ADU ordinance in the country that allowed 2 ADUs on every lot in the city by right. It had no additional parking or owner occupancy requirements. And we build an average of 10 new construction infill houses a year as small developers renovate at least one historic building and design an average of 200 units that clients build every year. We dig in and get our hands dirty. So starting with that lens, part of our housing challenge is not just population growth, but population relocation. We are living in a really different way than we used to live. And as we move into cities, we are eating up some of our most beautiful and productive land around them with sprawl. The lower the density of the development we allow, the more area it takes up. It is very simple math. And in some ways, our struggles in housing in Northwest Arkansas are nothing if not the champagne problems of successfully making it seem like a place that everyone wants to live. At this, we, and you all generally in all of your work, have been incredibly successful. And in other ways, I think that we need to admit to ourselves that we've failed to keep up with housing our population as we've convinced new people to move here. What we have tried hasn't worked, and it's not going to get better if we keep doing the same thing that we're currently doing. We have to try new things. No one thing is going to fix housing. Impact fees alone are not going to fix housing. This is a wicked problem. It is complicated, and we don't get to do this over again. So we can't just do one thing. We have to employ a full suite of tools to address this issue, and we need to be responsive to what happens as we roll them out and then adjust as we go. Because Northwest Arkansas is growing, whether we like it or not. Our population will double in the next 25 years, which means that half of our city has not been built yet. And we're going to talk a lot about population projections today. And so as we do, I want all of you to consider not just how scary some of these numbers and conclusions seem when we look at the projections, but I also want you to think about how significantly we've outperformed every previous projection. So this is best case scenario. And each of these people icons represents a new 5,000 residents. And these residents are living in a way that is often tough to wrap our brains around from a planning and housing standpoint, and which makes housing them even harder. Most of them want to live alone. We need a house, a dwelling unit, for each one of these people. But we're still thinking about planning and land use policy and financing as though a dwelling unit equates to a family of 5. And in fact, a full 72% of American housing units cater to those nuclear families that are a minority of US households and Northwest Arkansas households. These numbers are specific from 2022 to Northwest Arkansas, Washington, and Benton counties. So instead, we need to be providing more intentional housing for the majority of our households who only need 1 or 2 bedrooms on a daily basis. Not only to align the resources and land required per house more closely to the budget and size of that house, but because as our household size continues to shrink, we're working against the clock to provide housing not just to new residents, which we often feel is our challenge, but to an increasing number of current residents who would like to live in their own home. So this is a great Kronberg graphic. Our friends in Atlanta made this. And the thing that I want you to take away from this, right, is if we had no population growth whatsoever, our household size has halved since the 1950s. That means we need double the houses we needed in the 1950s before we even start to address population growth. So as we talk about density of units, I want you to all to think about this isn't necessarily about changing the landscape of what our city looks like. This is about being practical to demographic changes that are driving a huge mismatch between household sizes and household budgets. And we can't control, at least in any version of our regional planning that I've heard about, how many households will live here. We don't get to pick that new people won't move here. But we could control how big we allow them to be built, how big we let the lots that they're built on be, where they're located, and on how much land. Because right now we have really big houses for how many of them are housing one or two people. So why? Is that a market preference? It's not. Generally, we've made it illegal, individually, community by community, via zoning ordinances, to house people in anything other than a large lot single-family home. And guess what happened to our city growth when our large lot sizes weren't just allowed, but required? Our infrastructure growth was greater than the population growth. This is a map from the CDC. I see a representative from the university here. Thank you very much. I want you to note this left map. That's a population in Fayetteville of 7,000 people. You can see when single-family zoning was passed. The notes from the Planning Commission, where those were passed, noted that the goal was that there was too much low-cost housing in the city, that there was not enough luxury housing in the city. They wanted to pass a code that would make large homes on large lots the standard and discourage low-cost housing. How do you think they did? It was very effective. That was the goal. So as we see, this doesn't just create a housing affordability challenge that we cannot subsidize our way out of, right? We've chosen as a region to have these policies that are optional that we're in charge of. City council members, there's several of you here, you are in charge of our land use policies, and you could change our zoning at the next meeting. Like functionally, no, I know it doesn't really work that way, but you could vote, right? These are very flexible policies, even though they don't feel that way. That's the thing I want you to take away. You have an enormous amount of power over these policies, and these policies have an enormous amount of power over our housing. And we cannot subsidize our way out of a housing policy that is designed to make housing expensive. We might as well just set the money on fire. It will be more fun, I promise. Maybe more effective too. The so-called bypass around Fayetteville, right? It was meant to go around the city. Because of our intentional policies, now runs right through the middle of town. That map all the way on the right is a population of 70,000 people. The amount of infrastructure that our city tax dollars now have to support are completely out of scale to what our property taxes generate because of our optional policies. And this happened in only 2 generations. So for my town, and many of yours, our housing systems are not broken. They are working exactly the way that they were designed to work. So without replacing the laws that we've imposed on ourselves, we cannot subsidize or creatively hack our way out of our current housing system. And housing our current population, much less our population growth, this way has eaten up an enormous amount of productive and recreational land. And housing our population growth this way will decimate Northwest Arkansas as we know it. And for what? The classic American town looked a lot like this. Mixed use, apartments over shops, walkable main streets with small to no setbacks. City planners in here, I want you to note how narrow that street section is.
This is the image of most of our tourists and most of the towns in America. We put all the posts on our tourism website. I want you to go to your website and look at what photos you show to bring people to your community. These are often the most expensive places in town to live because they're most in demand. And we no longer allow people to build them. We loved them so much, we made them illegal. What we see being built is what's legal. We have decided to require this through a host of provisions that are generally adopted at the local municipality level, which means, again, city council members and mayors, it is fully within your power to fix this locally. The downside is we do have to do this in all 15 cities in the Northwest Arkansas region, individually, right? But the power is you can do that. We don't have to go to the state. We don't need to change federal policy. We don't have to, advocate defunding net. So let's get a few ideas to get started of things that we could do now. I had this one as a surprise, but we have to legalize housing that works and that we can afford. Because housing is expensive, because attainable housing formats are intentionally illegal. And it's not just about what people and what residents can afford. It's also about what our towns can afford, what our town budgets can afford. This is another set of slides from our friends at Crumber. They have generously allowed us to use these in several talks as we talk about some of our new policy changes. So this is a traditional suburban pattern, right? We've got 2 houses at a density of about 2.9 units per acre. Once we take out parks and raids, that's about where we sit. So we are generally talking about this, right? Which is we have how many, in this graphic, this is pretty statistically accurate, about 3.5 people. So we want people that we don't know anywhere to put. But I want you to shift your perspective a little bit and think about this more from an infrastructure, right? Those 2 people are their tax revenue, their property taxes that they write to county assessor once a year, are paying for sidewalks that we require to have around their street, curbs. Again, all of this is required, right? It's all codified in your city plans with street trees, 30 feet on center on average, minus driveways, in 10. We've got our utility poles. If we've been allowed to put the power overhead, hopefully it hasn't been required to go underground. It's even more expensive. Traffic lights, our street lights, the power for the street lights, the water lines, sewer lines, storm sewer lines, all the paving in that street. Your street standards probably require that paving to be the line with it needs to be a fire code, right? We've got a lot of infrastructure we require to support these two houses. It's also historically not what our streets. This is also a new experiment, this amount of infrastructure. So we have two people paying taxes with us, and that's just the physical infrastructure. Then we get into police, the fire department, schools, which is where most of the property taxes are going. I've talked to at least one school board member who's here. No one should hear more about property tax values than school boards. Trash pickup, right? We've got all of these services, and most of our cities feel so stressed trying to keep the finances on this working because the math doesn't pencil. We can't make this work. So as we talk about housing choice, as we talk about providing a wider variety of units, as we talk about letting people build in a way that works for them, we're not just talking about housing people, we're also talking about providing a set of financial situations that work for our cities long term. So this is a win-win for everybody, right? We now have a way to house different people at different price points at different phases of their life. Almost everyone will need a large single-family home at some point in their life. Most of us will not need one for most of our life. We also need to, kind of as we move out of that, be thinking more regionally. We touched on two of those pieces that we in my office have really started to nerd in the last year, which is the really simple premise that water runs downhill, right? And that actually might be our limitation to functional growth. So as I reinforce the need to think regionally, I want to point out that our region straddles 6 different watersheds, and infill growth is often limited by the sizes and conditions of water and sewer lines that are connecting them to the system. Robust master plans are going to be needed to ensure that growth is happening strategically. But here's the thing, our larger cities have the advantage of the map. Their water sewer lines are in their GIS systems. For some cities, it's taking years to fund building of that infrastructure facilities, and some of them still don't have digital. So that means we can't coordinate a capacity in our systems to our growth plan because it's invisible outside the heads of utility workers, which is why we're seeing miles of brand new 3-inch sewer lines getting ripped out and replaced with 8-inch lines a couple of years later to handle the loads from new subdivision. And our counties have even less budget to even know what infrastructure is to coordinate with. And the real limitation to growth is not truly landed. It's water and sewerage. We've got some cities now showing that they're starting to think about their growth strategies as service boundaries. It's not a growth boundary. It's where we can afford and functionally, with the physics of water, provide you with clean water and a toilet that flushes. Because water flows downhill. It doesn't respect our city boundaries. Johnson says it's sewer to Fayetteville. Bella Vista buys its water from Bentonville. This is a problem that can only be solved regionally. And so I'm going to give a very specific example from a regional city, not to pick on them, but to give you a micro example of a macro issue. It is not possible for the regional cities to think about sewer capacity except by doing it regionally and by coordinating deeply and informed by broad data about how and where we can even put grids. It's not helpful to change our zoning policies and build houses at a location that we can't provide them with toilets. So again, this is a truly illustrative example. I could have picked an example from Johnson or Fayetteville or Springdale. This is happening everywhere. This is just an easy one to talk about. Bentonville recently expanded
with a $75 million bond project, a sewer treatment plant, the NACA plant, to accommodate projected growth. Right? Makes sense. Bentonville is growing faster than anyone else. They are really starting to run up against their sewer capacity. Their leadership inherited a range of challenges with this sewer system. We inherited also an infrastructure system that was not designed for the growth that we're facing now. Our planning and our infrastructure planning often have no way to be coordinated. This specific plant that was expanded only drains, remember that watershed map? The area roughly south of 14th Street. The watershed line itself is a little bit more complicated than that, but I think you can think of it as being roughly south of 14th Street. So what is the city in charge of? not how many people we let move here, or where they go, or at what density their housing looks like. Those via zoning ordinances are what we control. But most of our municipalities don't have a calibrated utility system designed to our expansion plans. And regionally, we're not calibrating these things between municipalities either. So here is looking at the existing zoning, where this city has decided people can build housing at a higher density than those typical old school subdivisions. And if you do the math on that, it isn't currently legal to build the number of units in the service area of the system that the facility was designed to provide capacity for. And again, we're not picking on Bentonville. They needed to expand that plant. But current residents begin paying day one for that bond funding and for that new capacity, regardless of whether new citizens are in place to utilize it and chip in. And we have to begin to align the planning and density to where we have capacity in our system. And we also have to do this across municipal boundaries. Look at all of the other municipalities that control land that drains to this plant. When we start to use data to inform our growth strategy, suddenly we might realize that we need a new town center with higher density housing around it in this watershed. The location of that, if we look at this only two-dimensionally and on the surface, might not make sense to you. But water flows downhill, and our municipal boundaries cannot be where our planning and growth thinking stops. So as we start to think, too, about these recent decisions, Bentonville is currently updating its zoning. We have the opportunity to align density allowances within our current sewer capacity. Almost none of the what we would consider moderate density options provide enough capacity. So for my Bentonville residents here, I really want you guys to be champions of doing something that may politically be hard to support without thinking about this from a data-driven region, right? Your elected officials need your support and your explanation to neighbors of why you need more density south of 14th Street, because you are paying for that bond project now, and it is in your best interest to get those residents south of 14th, right? That's likely going to require a new walkable center. That planning process is ongoing. That alignment can happen. And Bentonville is a best case scenario, right? They have one of the best planning firms in the country, currently rewriting their zoning code. They have a water sewer director who is super tied into that process. We are giving you a best case example of the way that this can work, and this is happening across our region. But we have to think regionally. We cannot solve these problems within our sometimes Friday night lights, separate municipalities mental model. All right, finally, I want us to talk about making our math choices clear. And I'll move to Fayetteville to give you some examples on this one. We're going to draw some comparisons. This is a way that we present work at IncDev, and these are some slides from that. So we're going to look at some projects, and I also want to show you kind of the aggregate power of infill development and why you really should care more about this. These projects are all within a half-mile radius of our downtown. They're all inside the same cohesive neighborhood. And for comparison, I want to show you the thing that actually is legal over the vast majority of our land area. So this site up on the north end, not in our little radius, just for some comparisons, is a conventional developer's dream. It's got high traffic counts, it's got interstate access, it's a nice large lot. It's big, but it's also a suburban pattern, right? This is not the way that we used to build towns. This is the thing that we've been experimenting with since the 1960s that we require people to do. What I want you to pay the most attention to are the numbers at the bottom, that taxable value per acre, and that density number. So this one is the same pattern within our downtown neighborhood. You'll note that the value per acre is not dramatically different. This is the value of sprawl pattern development, no matter where we put it in the city. And to give you a baseline also, this is one of our nicest neighborhoods, right? This is a really fancy subdivision. This is the kind of values that we see on what we allow. 75% of our land, more or less, is the only thing we allow. So this is our value per acre when that's an expensive house. This is the value per acre, they're more or less the same, of a smaller, more affordable neighborhood. Again, this is a pattern value. I pulled a downtown example of this pattern, kind of as close as I could get to show you that it's pretty consistent, right? So this is a house that is in this half-mile radius that we're going to be looking at. about 1.8 million per acre. So it's a little more expensive than the neighborhood that's out on the east side of town, but not a lot. Big lot, big house. Now I want to show you what infill development and traditional town form is worth. I picked this one because it's the ugliest building that we've ever done. I wanted to show you it's not actually good architecture that makes these values. Traditional towns are built with buildings that are rectangles with a narrow side facing the street. I want you to think about the infrastructure that serves this little ugly building, right? It's 24 feet wide. That means it has half of a downtown 45-foot right-of-way, and its value per acre is approximately 7 times, we'll come back to this one, these guys. Now think about how much infrastructure wraps this pattern. How many square feet of asphalt does the city need to replace every time that street needs to be topped? What's our linear footage of curb that the city is paying to replace? What's the stormwater burden of that parking lot, right? How many linear feet of water and sewer line do we have? And again, this isn't market preference. This is what we're requiring. And it's worth less than 7 times the value of little ugly buildings built in traditional town form. Oh, it's not even 2-story. What could your city do with more tax revenue, with so much less infrastructure to maintain? What would that mean for you as a city? More parks, better customer service, safer streets. This one, Feed and Folly, was an empty building until, thank you to several people in the room, we eliminated our commercial parking standards. It was empty because there wasn't enough parking on site for any business to open in the building. So as soon as that code was changed, a restaurant opened in that is producing an enormous amount of not just increased tax revenue, but also increased A&P revenue from the extensive liquor sales that are done on that rooftop with a really nice view. Here's a project of mine that's just down the hill from that, and the entire appraised value of this property when I purchased it was about $10,000 an acre. And this is the power of traditional pattern and density. These numbers are simple math on information that you can pull from your assessor's website in a matter of minutes. You can test this in your own town, and you will find that even the very sad little ugly buildings built in a dense pattern are worth exponentially more than your new shiny strip malls. And this kind of analysis is based on the incredible work of Urban 3 out of Asheville and the Strong Towns blog, both of which you should be reading. But I want you to think about the underlying value proposition for municipalities and the underlying communities that are represented by these numbers. I am advocating not for you to make this required, but to allow it. This building is what looks like it was on a wide spot in the road. The developer is here. But it turned out to be an empty lot that, because of very small downtown lot size minimums, was buildable. And there's a metaphor here, right? Back to that farm soil health analogy. And you guys should never let me go with analogies. I'll always go too far. But lots of cities have fallow fields, right? Parcels that aren't being put into productive use. Most of them are on infrastructure we're paying for anyway. What do we think the tax revenue difference between that empty lot and this building are? The infrastructure is there to maintain, regardless of which one of these things we allow to be built. Think too about the relative flexibility of this building. If the market changes and we all decide we don't like beer anymore, I'm not holding my breath, that small retail space can be almost anything. It could be combined with the adjacent tenant space. It could be split into smaller commercial units. It could be converted into residential units. The apartments upstairs could be made into offices. That's how traditional town form building works and why it lasts. It isn't specialized, and it's adaptable to changing economics and changing needs. Fayetteville is a hot market, but the infrastructure challenges and comparative values between traditional town form and sprawl pattern development are the same everywhere we work. And note too that by building more individual dwelling units on smaller lots, we're also providing a lower price point of housing to a significantly increased number of residents. This is the smallest set of houses we've ever built. I also want you guys to think about, I hope you've been noticing the density numbers at the bottom of that slide too. We think about 26 units per acre as scary multifamily. And these are 500 square foot, 1-bedroom, 1-bath houses built to be age in place, accessible for seniors for the senior center across the street. This is a 50 by 150 traditional downtown lot. It's a corner lot, so we were able to split it into 4 micro lots. And these houses were sold fee simple with a secondary market mortgage for my finance nerds in the room, and only because our zoning allowed it. But the value of these little tiny houses that sold for, I will note, with no subsidy, affordable rates, they were sold at what turned out to be 80% of AMI for Fayetteville at the time of their first sale. They have doubled in value since then, but they were unsubsidized affordable housing because they could be built small and densely. So one more set of numbers, because again, this math is really important. This was a set of slides we put together to argue a project in Bentonville. We had an existing large house, it was not in great shape, on a really large parcel downtown. We were proposing splitting it into 4 townhouses. So we wanted to show what that does in terms of housing new residents and increasing the tax basis with no cost to the city. This is where my water sewer nerdness really started. Utilities are paid for in most communities, I didn't know this previously, by the service fees, not the usage fees. So the cost to provide you with a gallon of water is more or less what you pay for that gallon of water. The city is not making any money on that. Your service fee that you pay every month that is flat is actually where their revenue is coming from. So as we look at the image on the left is the existing downtown pattern and the existing sewer service fees that they're currently making on that downtown pattern. We had a couple projects that we were proposing on the same block. So we were showing if we were allowed to build those out, what would happen to their service fees with no increase in any of their infrastructure cost. There was capacity for this. So as the block is infilled, we can see how significantly our service fee income can be increased we can generate significantly more revenue with no additional cost. Any business leader in the town is going to tell you that's how we want businesses to work. And then also, most of those accounts are for 1 or 2 people. So the increased density on existing infrastructure also represents that many acres of undeveloped sensitive ecosystems at the edge of town. It also provides more walkable communities that can better support local small businesses. And pattern matters. Increasing density to 1/4 acre lots on sewer systems, which is the pattern on the left, which is mostly what we allow, against that built-out neighborhood in downtown, you can start to see why we're running into some problems paying our bills. When we only allow the thing on the left, we've made it illegal to build anything that we can actually pay for. And utility policies matter. Here's where this is going to take all of you doing everything that you can do in the ways that you control things. There was a suggestion after Urban 3 came to town that they should put all utilities outside the right-of-way so that they were cheaper to maintain because the water sewer system wasn't solvent, so that we needed to lower maintenance costs. So we were looking at the same area. Here's our buildable area, right? Here's the amount of land that we can generate revenue on in this downtown area. If we put all of our utilities in easements outside the right-of-way, we cut our taxable area of our city by about 25%. Wider streets and wider rights-of-way also cost more money up front to install. They cost more money long-term to maintain, and they create more stormwater runoff for the city to handle. Most of our water sewer capacity is actually used in leakage. 40% of the water and sewer that we treat and pay for is actually just leakage from groundwater. The shorter the pipes are, the less they leak. If we add a setback that triples the length of line to every single house via a policy like this, we have also tripled the length of line in our system, even if we have all our other policies right. This is how much, this stuff is complicated, guys. Okay, so are you convinced about density yet? Have we made some ground? Okay, so I'm gonna give you one more set of images to really think that through. Here's what we need to provide for annually. Here's our current projections. Washington County's on the left, Benton County's on the right. There's our number of residents divided by our average household size. This is the number of new dwelling units that we need to be providing in some format every year. This is an annual number. You can see where we're running behind. This, as we've discussed, is the most common density allowed in Northwest Arkansas. And there is nothing wrong with this kind of neighborhood. No one is saying it should be illegal. But this isn't the street we put on the postcards, right? And it's not the street that pays the bills. So there's nothing about it that makes sense as the only thing we allow. It doesn't preserve much natural area. Despite all the green space, it's mostly Bermuda grass that we're spraying blue once a year. And the houses in these neighborhoods aren't even terrifically affordable anymore. But this is business as usual. It's the status quo. And if we keep up with business as usual, which is a few banner multifamily projects downtown, the vast majority of our growth in single-family neighborhoods on the outskirts of town. That means we will need about 8.2 square miles of development every year. Rob Smith and I really nerded out on how we came up with that number. I've got a lot of back page math if you're interested. And the first year doesn't look that bad, right? We're pretty used to this. The second year is a little bit more like a frog in a boiling pot. Sure, there's more roads, there's more traffic, there's more subdivisions under construction on the edge of town, but we're pretty used to this. And I also want to note about these graphics. We're not saying this is where the neighborhoods would go. We're showing you blue is existing urbanized area. Pink is the new amount of area, the volume of space that we would need to urbanize to keep up with our growth. Let's jump forward 10 years. It's starting to look a little less comfortable. Anybody else have a little yikes? So here's 2050. The ground area of developed land in Northwest Arkansas would more than double with status quo. And again, we're not saying this is where it will go. This is about the scale of growth that will happen if we continue on the path that we're on. Not making a decision to change is a decision for this to happen. And this is also only 2050. That's just a projection point we've picked and are working towards. After that, by all accounts, we will keep growing. And we only have so much land in Northwest Arkansas that makes it the place that we love to call home. And we have a lot of work to do to build the region the way that we want it. We have to do things in ways that we have not done them before within our memories. And we're gonna have to make doing the right thing not only the only option, but the best option. And likely that will mean growing at a very different density than we are used to seeing, which does not have to be a bad thing. So one of those projects you saw earlier, my first new construction project that I designed and developed myself. We've hit almost 20 units an acre with small detached single family homes. One of our residents is actually here, which I always love. I guess he's moved out now, but he still owns it. Even with much larger units, most of these are over 3,000 square feet in Atlanta, we can still hit great density and walkable locations. The historic districts of most of our towns are full of what we would call mansion flats, like this one, which are scaled like a big old grand house. Sometimes they were, but they hold a number of small dignified apartments. A lot of them were converted in the Depression. There's that little infill project, right? Our 4 mini houses. And if groundworks work is widely successful, we'll see significantly more of these on the ground. Building out neighborhoods like this will require, as we've discussed, giant policy change and alignment at every level. But it will also require public education and, frankly, winning some hearts and minds, which is something that Groundworks is taking the lead on. And this public advocacy work will be critical to support your elected officials in making the policy changes happen. And in some parts of town, not exclusively in the places that we're used to historic downtowns, I think if we're doing this right, we may start to see some small mixed-use buildings and walkable nodes that will push our density up past 50 units an acre. They can, if we get the details right, still be enormously lovable places. And as a built environment professional, I'm talking to you a lot about buildings and streets and density, but I want to end this with a reminder of 2 things. The first is that the built environment isn't about the buildings. We are building the backdrop of people's lives. We're building the cafe that they'll have their first date in, and the street that they'll push their first child down in a stroller, and the sidewalks that we'll walk on as we mourn the death of our parents. This isn't about buildings. This is about building a place for people to live. And so also time is of the essence, right? Not just for our natural environment, but for the childhoods that we'll miss if this takes 20 years to get right. And so finally, the thing that I want to end on, we always show this in our InkDev trainings. What we've done has not been enough. Each of us working together, even with the best of intentions, cannot solve this alone. We have to work together at every level that we possibly can to rebuild Northwest Arkansas into the place that we love. Thank you.